Hello, welcome to another program from Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman. It is October 1st, 2025, and this is our program on Benedict Arnold's March to Quebec in 1775. We are looking at really right now, we're kind of right in the midst of the 250th anniversary of that expedition. And of course, we're in the midst of the 250th birthday of the United States. So this is part of our semi-quincentennial programming. We've got lots more to come next year. Tonight we're talking about Benedict Arnold, his time in Maine, and his march to Quebec. Before I introduce our speaker, we'll just take a moment to remember and to acknowledge that we are on Wabanaki homelands and we recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we affirm our commitment to partnering with Wabanaki people to share and contextualize this history with program offerings. Certainly, Wabanaki stories are a big part of this history, are a big part of Arnold's March and of American Revolution history. So joining us tonight is Thomas Desjardin. He is the author of this book. Um, Let me check and make sure everybody can see this properly because I'm on blur. Can you see the cover? There we go. Through a Howling Wilderness. And this is a great book about Arnold's March, and it's available at Maine Historical Society. I will share that link with you guys in the chat in a moment. He's also the author of Stand Firm, Ye Boys from Maine, the 20th Maine and the Gettysburg Campaign, and These Honored Dead, How the Story of Gettysburg Shaped American Memory. And he joins us tonight. Tom, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I wanted to try to personalize this a little bit. I spoke a couple of different times now recently because of the anniversary tonight. Somewhere around the town of Norridgewock, 250 years ago today. My voice is a little weak, so bear with me.
No worries.
The men of Arnold's March bedded down for the night, and still in the Kennebec, still in fairly high spirits, still having villagers to trade with a little bit. And so not anywhere near the suffering that they were about to endure and had yet to know. But some background, because it's always interesting. I always say to people they ask about a book, and I say, well, get to know a little bit about the author, and especially with biographies, and it'll help you to understand the story behind it. I was born and raised here in Maine. I'm an 11th generation Mainer, and I always add to that I had nothing to do with that. That was an accident, but my family settled at the Isle of Shoals, so the program coming up is interesting. My great was an indentured servant and a fisherman in the 1630s. So when I grew up, stories of interesting Maine history and important Maine events always fascinated me. Fast forward many years, I went back to the University of Maine, get my PhD in 19th century U.S. history, and ended up studying the Civil War because of Joshua Chamberlain, who grew up 19 miles from my house, and because I happened to go to Gettysburg for the summer, which lasted 6 years while I was writing my dissertation. But I have mostly written because I also worked for many years at Gettysburg and then back here in the park system. I was 20 years in state government. So I haven't always been a full-time author, and I've never had the attention span to write that 500-page volume about one subject. So I've always written about stories that fascinate me, usually from my childhood, and that have sort of been forgotten. And I will write a 220-page book that will put the story back in the public imagination, and then let somebody else come along and oh, that's a good idea, and then let them write the 500-page book. And that one succeeded in spades with Through a Howling Wilderness, because the last academic book, the last nonfiction book about the march, I wrote mine in 2005 and 6, was in 1903. It had been that long since anyone had written a nonfiction sort of scholarly work. And that was largely because Benedict Arnold became a traitor, and there's no explaining that away. He was a hero before, but he was absolutely a traitor and deserves all of the bad things we say about him. But not yet, at least in terms of the story. And so I set about to write the story. Now, when I was a kid, close friend of our family's had a camp. It was a beautiful log cabin on Arnold Pond. The northern end of Arnold Pond is basically the Canadian border at Covengore, right near the crossing station. And my father belonged to the social club, and the members would go up to this cabin for a week every winter and hunt, and a week every summer and fish. And we would go visit this beautiful cut granite fireplace hearth. And in its day, it had been quite a glorious spot. And it turns out it had been owned by Jacob Rupert, who owned the New York Yankees. He was the famous beer magnate. And the cabin next door was owned by the Le Bombier family. They're the folks with snowmobiles. And so it was a famous thing back then. To rich and famous people had these little cabins and fishing spots in Maine that they would retreat to. And one of the funny stories about it was one day somebody was up visiting, and they were wandering around the woods, and they came out with an oxen yoke around their neck, the thing you hook around a bucket on either end, and came walking in. Look what I found in the thing. Well, somebody finally realized it's not an oxen yoke. That's half of the outhouse toilet seat. And so they, not as reverent as about history as others, they hung it over the big, beautiful mantle and put a sign on it that said, "Babe Ruth shat here," because Babe Ruth was one of the people that visited and stayed at this cabin and fishing and so on. And so those kind of stories are interesting. But along the way, up Route 27, there used to be, they've aged out, but at each of these stops, these little signs that were painted somewhat cartoonish, but not silly. So a kid could enjoy them, but an adult wouldn't think they were silly. And they described the march. Here, Arnold's men did this, and here they did that. Here they ate their shaving cream, and here they ate their moccasin leather, and here they ate their dogs. And when you're 10 years old, that's like, oh, that's a good story. I can't wait to go see the next one. So this is how I fell in love with this particular story and kind of filed it away in the back of my head. And when I moved home from Gettysburg in 2001, I think, I dusted it all out and decided to write the book. And so off I went, explaining the story. And it's an interesting one because Arnold had been a trader, Trader, meaning a fellow who traded in goods. And in his travels and sailing had heard of this supposed route up the Kennebec River, over the Heideland, right at Covengore, and then down, because it runs north, the Chaudière River, Chaudière meaning boiling cauldron. It's a shallow river with bony, it's bony, as we say in Maine, the rocks, right into Quebec. Easy as can be. And all the way back to Samuel de Champlain, people had heard of this passageway. And when the time came to, the Battle of Bunker Hill had occurred. The British had decided they weren't coming out of Boston that year. And the Americans camped above the city watching the British, heard that there was a raid on Machiasport. And this British vessel and an escort had gone up to get lumber. And they deduced from that they were going to build barracks and stay in Boston all winter. So here's George Washington with an army trying to hold it together, all volunteers. There's no country yet, still almost a year before the Declaration. And he's got to do something with them, and the British aren't coming out. So he has to do something, or these guys are going to kill each other because they're in camp and they came for a fight. And so he and Arnold start talking about this pathway, and geez, if the British ever come and take Quebec City and really fortify it, they could cut the colonies in half going down Lake Champlain. And what if we took a group of people and, it's a wilderness, it's hard. Into this conversation walks a fellow named Reuben Colburn, who lives in what's today is Pittston. And he was a boat builder. And he knew Washington. He was a lumber partner with John Hancock and other people. And they said, well, we're talking about this idea of going up to Quebec. He goes, well, I live on the river. He says, if you come to where I am, I'll build you the boats. Because they could go from ship to boats. And as you know, at Augusta, you can't sail any further. But you needed the boats not to carry the people so much. It was a march. But to carry their powder and their flour and their fish and their supplies and so on. And as time went on, and you emptied a boat because you ate all the supplies or you'd consolidate and just leave the boat. So it truly was a march, but they needed the bateau, they called them, the white man's canoe, the natives called it, to put their gear in and push it upstream. They paddled and they pushed. And so Washington said, well, I'm going to send you back with a little bit of cash. You get everybody in your neighborhood to start building these boats. We need 200 of them. And we need four setting poles, four paddles, two setting poles, four paddles, and all the other accoutrements that you need for each of these boats. And you have to get them done in 10 days. So Goebert said, okay. And he went back home, gathered all the locals, and said, this is what we have to do. Well, somebody pointed out at that point that Home Depot hadn't opened yet. So there was no lumber. Reuben had a mill and he had logs in the Kennebec, but he had no sawn lumber. And as you know, most of you, you saw a brand new log that's been cut, especially floating in the river. It's wet and it's flexible and it's heavy. And the bateaux were lapstrake boats, meaning the pieces of the boat overlapped the next one down. The problem with that is that when those lapstrakes flex, which green wood does, they leak. And as heavy as they were much more difficult to paddle. Some people have criticized Reuben for making bad boats. It wasn't his fault. That was the lumber he had, so he made the boats. So Arnold gets his army together, gets it to Newburyport, Massachusetts. They sail up to Maine. They unload into the boats. And when Arnold gets off the ship, he says, some of them are too small. I need 20 more. And sure enough, 2 days later, Reuben and his men had built another 20 boats. But the sum of them are too small tells us that they were different sizes based on who knows what. The other difficulty is the way you make up for flexible wood is you use more nails. And back then, nails were made one at a time on an anvil. And every guy standing making a nail one at a time on an anvil is not building a boat, is not cutting a log. And so the fact that in about 10 or 12 days, they put together this flotilla of 220 boats and put Arnold's men in them and sent them up the river is an amazing feat. And sure enough, the boats leaked, the flour barrels burst, the fish got wet, they were dried fish. And it was difficult, but it got them up the river. And so up they went as far as Fort Western. And then Arnold split the army into three pieces. Well, he sent up a group of scouts, and then he split the army into three pieces. The first one, smaller, more agile, fewer supplies, to cut a trail through this Indian route, basically, as they called it, up into Canada. And the next one's a little bit bigger, a few more supplies. And then the third one, because the trail would be cut by then, would carry the bulk of the supplies. And so up they go, up the river in groups in three sort of waves, if you will, and started their march. And at first they did fairly well. They traded with the locals and thought of it as a kind of a jolly adventure. I should mention they left the Colburn House around the 21st of September. And if you decide you're going to walk to Quebec from Maine, 21st of September is probably a little late in the season to think it would be a good idea, but they did. And off they went. And from there, fast forward a little bit, they got up into the what's called the Great Carrying Place. You leave the Kennebec River to avoid the big whitewater rafting area of the Kennebec and the big hook that goes around into the Dead River. The natives had figured out there were these three ponds, and they would climb up a very steep embankment for almost a mile into the first pond, and then they could paddle their canoes across the pond and save walking. Get to the far side of the pond, take out, walk some more, get to the next pond. And they do this great carrying place, it was called. It gave them some relief. They could paddle a lot of the way, and it saved having to hike. And they cut a path, but 4 or 5 Native Americans walking is not an army of 1,100 people, and that's how many men Arnold left the Colburn House with. So up they went, these big heavy boats up steep cliffs and hither and yon. And as they got up into that part of the world, there were fewer people to trade with, less food, and so they had a difficult time. But one of the things you encounter when you do historical work is that, for example, when they got just north of Norridgewock, today's village of Norridgewock, I noted that Arnold stayed in the house of the widow Warren. Right away, my mind went, well, why was there a widow? And were there people living up that far? And so you sort of pursue that. And it turns out you learn all these, for me, great Maine stories by pursuing these little tangents. Up above Norridgewock, 5 families, I think it was 7 in all, but 7 adult men and about 5 families had settled up further in the river because it was cheaper land and they were trying to find a place to start their own lives without much money. And they had started a village. And that fall, they had done what they do. They had a big war canoe, big overgrown canoe. And all the adult males got in with all the corn and the wheat to paddle down to probably the Falls of Skowhegan, where Reuben Colburn had another sawmill and probably a grist mill. And they would grind their corn and wheat, put it back as flour and meal, paddle up, and that would be their supply of food for the winter other than game. So the 7 men got in the canoe, paddled down, and as legend has it, hit this thing called Death Rock. So named because when they hit it, the canoe went over, and six of the men swam to one shore, and one man swam to the other shore. Now, the fellow who swam to the other shore had the unenviable task of walking back to the village to inform the locals that not only had every adult male in the village perished except for him in this accident, but so did all of their wheat and flour, all their flour and meal for the year. And so they abandoned the village. And when Arnold arrived, he stayed at the home of one of the widows. So in crafting a story like this, you find these little tangents. Probably the biggest tangent and the most fun to study is the story of Jacataqua, who, as legend has it, was an Indian princess, already a word that raises a little bit of suspicion, who took up with Aaron Burr and during the course of the march became his consort and so on. The story gets so elaborate that he ends up leaving her in a convent because she got her pregnant, and it becomes this elaborate story. So the question for us is, was there ever a Jacataqua? Well, supposedly, the legend goes, she lived on the northern end of Swan Island with this Indian tribe, and she was the princess. Well, what we know about Maine history in Native Americans, they didn't have princesses. And frankly, they didn't really have tribes the way we think of them today or back then. The natives then lived in the summertime in relatively smaller family groups. And then they came together in the fall to winter together at a rendezvous point, if you will. And over the many years, archaeologists have looked and looked and looked all over the northern end of Swan Island for any evidence at all over the last 5,000 or 6,000 years of Native American presence in large numbers, and it's just not there. So, okay, maybe the term princess meant something else, and maybe they're a little off because there was a very large archaeological evidence of a village or one of these rendezvous points on the Dresden side of the river. So maybe that's a little off. But when you sit down and look through the situation, Henry Dearborn, who was one of the officers on the march, strangely enough, after surviving the whole thing to Quebec and the battle at Saratoga and everything else, decided to settle back in what we now think of as Gardner in Maine. And you wouldn't think he would want to go back to the scene of such a terrible event in his life, but he did. And he was a Jeffersonian. He was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of War, in fact. If you know anything about the politics at the time, Aaron Burr was not. He was on the other side of the political ideology back then. And Burr, besides shooting Alexander Hamilton in a duel, had been involved in this treasonous effort to unite southwestern parts and rebel against the country. It's a lot of political underpinnings that went on after the war. And one day, as the story goes, Henry Dearborn was sitting on his porch down in Gardner, and a local minister stopped by, and they just started to chat. And Dearborn told the story of the march and this woman, Jacataqua, and what better way to damage the reputation of a political enemy than to put him in consort with, a lesser Native American woman and all the things you think about in those days, and then get her pregnant and all this. It's really, dark story. And so immediately you go, that's just so stereotypical. Surely, that's a little over the top. So another Gardnerian, Robert Tristram Coffin, wrote a poem about Jacataqua and reintroduced her. And so her legend is quite well known now. The thing about history is you can often prove something doesn't exist. You find evidence that says, well, that she didn't live on Swan Island, and the natives have information and so on. But and it makes more sense that Henry Dearborn would weave this tale to damage his political foe and so on. But it's very difficult to prove that something did happen, because if you get 3 or 4 people telling a story, I don't know which person to believe necessarily. So we uncover a lot of myths and legends this way, but we don't always get to prove them. One of the most fun I used to have when I taught college was my first day of class, I would say to the students, Napoleon wasn't short, the Vikings didn't wear horns, and the Pilgrims didn't sail their fragile wooden ship with all their worldly belongings toward a rock in the middle of Plymouth Harbor. Each of those myths and legends has behind it, frankly, sometimes a hilarious story of how it came to be. And when you piece it together, this is just silly. But in its origins start with some story somebody told, and 20 years later, somebody thought they heard somebody else tell it. And Arnold's March and almost every piece of American history has these little tidbits in it that make it fun to study and learn about. And that's another one of the things that drew me to the story. So Arnold and his men went to Fort Western, gathered and organized, started off in their three pieces. While they were there, a little bit of rum and a little bit of mischief, and one fellow pulled out his musket and just fired it into the house, the Howard house, the big truck house at the fort, and killed whether or not it was the person he intended to or not. In the dark, everybody was sleeping. He killed him. Ran away. They caught him. By the time they got him back to court-martial him, he died of natural causes. The first casualty of the march. But up they went across the Great Carrying Place to avoid all of the difficulty of marching across up against the Whitewater River. And another story of the march, they get above, put into the Dead River, and they paddled away. And one night they bedded down, left their bateau on the ground, sat about 10 feet above the river. And in the middle of the night, their campfires went out because this terrible storm came through. Now there's a discussion of this great hurricane. And big storms are hurricanes to people. It's a good term to use, but it was not a hurricane in that particular year. The following year, which is interesting, the Great Independence Hurricane happened. And there's a great deal of record of other places in New England that were ravaged by this great storm. But in 1775, there was no record of a hurricane per se. I look back at the old films of, the weatherman and the forecast, and there weren't any. But the interesting part of it is it doesn't take a hurricane to make you think you're in a hurricane and the water to rise 10 feet. Up in that area, the state, some of the sides of the rivers are very steep, and so the water rises up quickly because of the channel. And so they woke up because their campfires went out because the water had risen about 10 feet, washed away their bateau because they had left them down by the river, not having, looked at the farmer's almanac or the forecast for the week. And so now many of them have lost their food, their boats. Some of them are probably glad to see those go because they don't have to carry them anymore over the falls and over the other places. But they started to make a calculation, which was how far they had to go to get over the height of land at Cobengore and then through a probably uninhabited area to reach what we call the Quebecois villages. The Quebecois people, French Canadians, lived southward from Quebec. And again, as I mentioned, the Chaudière flows northward. And so the further south you went on the Chaudière, much like the further north you went on the Kennebec and the Dead, you got less and less population and poorer people. Now, the idea was, at the time, the colony, if you will, of Quebec went all the way to Ohio and Michigan. And Arnold and Washington hoped that perhaps they could bring in on our side, meaning the Patriot side, a huge number of people who would go help to fight the British. It didn't work because the Quebecois, although they would have loved to have thrown off the yoke of British tyranny, lived under the old feudal system from England, where a lord appointed by whomever, the crown, or ruled over an area and essentially rented the land. You could keep it as long as you paid the tithing to the lord and satisfied his wishes. But you never really owned your own land, and you're always, subject to his rule. And so while we'd love to go with you, Arnold, and help you throw off the British, because if we get the British gone, the feudal system collapses. We own our land now. We don't have to, pay anybody for it. And that would be a great way to live. But if we try it and fail, we get kicked off our land. The other calculation that they were making, the men of Arnold's march, was it's this many days, we think, to the Quebecois villages. And we have this many pounds of food, and that doesn't match up. There's not enough food to get us there. Around this time, that larger group in the back, under the command of a guy named Colonel Enos, was dealing with the storm and the rain and everything else, even though he had a wider path than most of the food and supplies. And at some point, kind of mysterious still, he decided, I'm going to turn around. And he said that he sent messages up to Arnold to tell him they never got through. So a large chunk of the army simply turned and went back to Fort Western and eventually back to Newburyport. When Washington saw them arrive in Boston, he tried to court-martial Enos, but the problem was all of the witnesses were still up in the Maine woods making their way to Quebec, and so he was unable to do it in the time it took before Enos's commission expired. So Arnold and his men are sitting on the shore waiting for the guys with the food to come. Nobody's coming and nobody's coming. And eventually continue the march. And it got very difficult for them. I'm going to hope I don't screw up the screen here while I look up this thing I want to read to you. This is still a few weeks away. in terms of the march. And of course, it slowed at this point. Food's gone, the boats are gone. But a fellow named Timothy Bigelow, who was a member of one of the people on the march, and this has always interested me because he sat down to write a letter. This is on the 26th of October, so still 3 weeks away. Gives you a sense of how slow they were moving at this point. He wrote a letter to his wife. Now, he's in the middle of the Kennebec, in the middle of the wilderness. And I've often wondered, how is he going to mail it? Or if he was going to stick it in his pocket, and when they found his body 5 years from now, they'd find it puzzles me. But he sat down and wrote basically a goodbye letter to his wife. And it explains the situation that he was in. It says, October 26, 1775, on that part of the Kennebec called the Dead River, 95 miles above Norridgewock. Dear wife, I am at this time well, but in a dangerous situation, as is the whole detachment of the Continental Army with me. We are in a wilderness nearly 100 miles from any inhabitants, either French or English, and about 5 days' provisions on average for the whole. We are this day sending back the most feeble and some that are sick. If the French are our enemies, it will go hard with us, for we have no retreat left. In that case, there will be no alternative but the sword and famine. In other words, we will have to seize the food from the poor Quebecois or starve ourselves. May God in his infinite mercy protect you, my more than ever dear wife and my dear children. Adieu, and never believe me to be your most affectionate husband, Timothy Bigelow. And Bigelow Mountain, by the way, is named after Timothy. Again, did he have stamps? Was there a big blue mailbox somewhere that he could, but he wrote the note. So a couple of other quotes from this particular part. My privations, not from him, but my privations in every way were such as to produce a willingness to die, without food, without clothing to keep me warm, without money, and in a deep and devious wilderness. The idea occurred and the means were in my hands of ending my existence. Our spirits were so depressed by the occurrences of this day that death would have been a welcome messenger to have ended our woes. So from this point, over the big mountain, we know at least 7 bateaux made the trip over the height of land and maybe no more. A couple of years ago, they discovered the nails laid in the ground where the bateaux were, so we know that some of them made it. And the men continued on because they had little else to do. Just to fast forward, of the 1,100 people that left the Colburn House on roughly the 21st of September, 400 of them eventually reached the shores of the St. Lawrence River at Quebec in December. In between, a couple other interesting things happened. The Dead River, as I mentioned, is dead most of the time, except for then. And there's a place on the Dead called Chateauguay Falls. And to this day, if you go up to Chateauguay, well, now it's been such a drought, you could walk across Chateauguay Falls and your ankles won't get wet, but most of the time your knees might get a little damp. Not a very treacherous river or part of the river. But there, a couple of the members of the march who wrote talked about a chest of coins that was in Arnold's canoe. And because of the toiling and the storm and the water, the chest fell out of the canoe to the bottom, and they called it the payroll. The reason that was important, as I just mentioned in Bigelow's letter, is not so much the money, but that in order to get the food away from the Quebecois to survive, they would have to pay for it. Because the Quebecois, if they gave up their meal and their corn and their winter stocks, wouldn't have been able to survive the winter. But if they sold it, they could go further up the river and buy supplies. And so that chest of coins represented starvation or not. And for years and years, people have searched and searched for Arnold's treasure. And they have looked, well, the river was swollen, so maybe it was over here, what's not where the river is now. And they've dove and they've in vain. And one day I had gotten a letter from a guy named Getchell. And there were 3 Getchell brothers who lived in the area just north of, we call it Vassalboro today. And meaning the further away from town you go, the poorer you were, the less you had. And they were pretty up on the outskirts of civilization. And these 3 brothers, Arnold had, Reuben Colburn and then Arnold had sent scouts up the river to go look around and see what was going on. And 2 brothers went up one time and 2 different brothers another time. And Frank, their descendant, had written to me and said, this is a mix-up. This time it was these 2 brothers, the other time it was these 2 brothers, but it was important to him. And Frank owned this little store at a place called Getchell's Corner, right near the river in Vassalboro. He sold cigarettes and beer, and he sat in his big recliner in the back room. And I went to visit him. And I said, no, Frank, I got your letter. And we talked, and he set me straight on which brother went which, and it was a bit interesting visit. Now, if any of you have ever seen the television show Columbo with Peter Falk, you know that almost every mystery was solved at the last minute when Peter Falk was on his way out the door after interviewing the criminal. He went, there's one more thing. And he would ask the question that solved the whole case. And I had one of those moments, and Frank gets a store. I grabbed the door. I said, Frank, nice to meet you. Grabbed the doorknob, and he said, there's one more thing. I said, yeah, what's that, Frank? If you ever figure out all this land here was bought by those brothers. And he said, for the life of me, these guys didn't have two coins to rub together. I don't know where they got the money. So if you ever figure that out, you let me know. Immediately, I looked at my watch and said, what time does the county registry of deeds close? Because I know exactly where the money came from. Sure enough, in 1778, I'm going to see if I actually have the description here because I'd like to read. Well, I know it by heart by now. Most of you who bought a home know that you have a deed, and it usually says something like for $1 in consideration therein. Mortgages have the financing part, but the deed just means somebody paid money for it. There isn't a description of how much. And it's certainly not this description. But somebody knew that Frank and Nehemiah might be up to something. And so it said, paid to me in hand by Frank and Nehemiah Getchell, gold and silver coins of the current circulating currency of North America. Da, 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 da. So the person registering the deed was leaving behind evidence that these two guys should not have had this kind of money, and surely they got it somewhere they shouldn't have. But they waited 3 years to buy the land, and no one was the wiser until we found Arnold's treasure. Someday I'll count up the number of acres. Interestingly enough, my wife and I about 5 years ago bought a farm where I'm sitting today in Winslow, just over the Vassalboro line. We may be half a mile from Arnold's treasure. So it's a piece of land that has since been divided up. But if you're ever driving up the Winslow Vassalboro side of the river and you go by Ketchell's Corner, stop and say, I'm standing on Arnold's treasure, because that's where it ended up. You disappoint a lot of people who are still waiting around in Chattagee Falls thinking it's got to be here somewhere, but it's probably not. So those are another of those little stories, that the tangents you sort of fly off on. So Arnold's men died of everything you can die of in the Maine woods. They starved to death. They died of eating too quickly after starving. They were struck by trees that fell. They drowned. They died of disease. They froze to death. It was one morning after they got over the height of land, they woke up frozen to the ground because they were wet when they fell asleep, and they had to pull themselves from the ice that they had fallen into. It was a miserable existence, but 400 of them somehow, eventually with the help of the Quebecois, were nursed them back to health, gave them food, and then waved and said, I'm not going with you, but you go have be successful and we'll come help you. Made it to the other side across the river from St. Lawrence River from Quebec. From inside of Quebec, a particular writer wrote about what an amazing feat it was. It's not possible for 10 men to make that march through the trail. People knew the wilderness. But the idea that an army of, well, they thought 400 of them appeared, was just beyond the pale. It was something on the order of Hannibal. And Arnold was immediately in the colonies and in Canada considered a hero and an amazing military commander to have pulled it off. Trouble was, the St. Lawrence River is a mile wide there, and all the boats had been taken away by the British as soon as they knew that Arnold was coming. So somehow they managed to gather up a few canoes and a few boats, and about a quarter of the men that were left could fit in these vessels, cross the river in the middle of the night, set up on the shore, go back, get the other. They got 3/4 of the men across the river, and daylight started to begin to appear. And remember, this is an all-volunteer army. There's not really a country yet. And so Arnold couldn't order them to attack the city. And also remember, naturally, this is the most fortified city in North America. Then they fortified it. So it's up on a high cliff, and then the walls are made of stone. And so they walked out on the plains of Abraham next to the city and took a vote, the officers did, as to whether or not to attack. Do we attack now, or do we wait till tomorrow night when we get the other quarter of our men across? So by one vote, they said, yeah, let's wait, much to Arnold's chagrin. During the night, a British officer came from Montreal, got inside the city, and started to fortify it. What they learned later, to their ever-loving shame, I guess, was that if they had simply walked into the city, the gates were open and unlocked, unguarded. They could have simply unfurled a flag and said, we claim this city in the name of the American colonies. and Quebec would have fallen. Instead, this particular British officer closed the gates, locked it, manned it, and when Arnold's men went to attack it or thought about attacking it the next day, it was impenetrable, at least for now. But that might have been the best thing that ever happened in this particular part of the story, because I want to fast forward just a little. That was essentially the end of Arnold's march, per se, as difficult as it was. But there's something very important about that moment. And let me back up also. About this time, another force of men from the colonies had come up Lake Champlain by boat to an area not that far from where Arnold's men were, and under General Montgomery. And he sent a messenger over to Arnold to coordinate with him. And I often thought the worst day that the men on the march endured was the day that they looked up and here comes an officer of the Colonial Army who had gone by boat up Lake Champlain with all the food, not carrying the bateau, and who had walked and stood at a point where they were standing, having gone through all of that they had gone through. If we had just gone by boat with that guy, we wouldn't have done any of this stuff. I've often wondered if they thought about, oh, he had it the easy way, and how much different it would have been if they had sailed up Lake Champlain. And anyway, so now Arnold is cooperating with General Montgomery and two American groups of soldiers. And they devise a plan to attack the city near New Year's, because on the New Year's night or midnight, January 1st, the army could dissolve. The men's enlistment were up. And so if they didn't attack the city, they could simply walk home. They had no obligation to remain. So they got luck with the weather. It was a bit of a blizzard, not much moon. And so General Montgomery devised the idea he'll attack the city from one direction, the upper town, and Arnold could attack from another direction and keep the British soldiers in Quebecois that the British were forcing to take care of the buildings split up, and they could fight, and one side or the other would get into the city. And Montgomery came down a path unaware that there was a cannon implant, and the men, the Quebecois who manned the cannon, ran, except one guy said, ah, heck, and he touched off the cannon right before he left, and it killed General Montgomery. Immediately upon Montgomery's death, his men simply left and went back to the Plains of Abraham, leaving Arnold on the other side of the city trying to attack, except the British soldiers in Quebecois who were defending that could simply go over and help on the other end, so all the forces could concentrate. Another misfortune is almost immediately as the battle started, Arnold was shot in the leg, went down, badly injured. Henry Dearborn dragged him to the rear. And so the Americans did the best they could to fight the battle, but without a leader, without Montgomery, they holed up in a warehouse for a while. Most of them were many of them were captured and imprisoned for a couple of months in basically a dungeon in Quebec before they were simply sent home. But some of them made it away, and this is the important part of the story as well. They harassed and harangued the British because the British were sitting over in England. That's where British sit sometimes, I learned. And they decided to send one more army into this is a very expensive thing, this revolution. You have to recruit an army, pay it, outfit it, arm it, sail it across the ocean, continue to feed it, continue to supply it. It was very expensive. And the English were very busy with other wars and other places and funding a navy. The crown was tapped out. They decided to send one more army. And one of those was, the choice was, we can either send it to Quebec and save the city and sail down the Champlain, St. Lawrence and the Champlain, cut the colonies in half and win the revolution that way. And we can just sail to New York, find Washington, or Boston, New York, find Washington and end the army, end the war that way. Well, because Arnold and his men had threatened but failed to take Quebec, the British decided we should go rescue the city and then Montreal. So they sent this army to Quebec. If Arnold had taken the city that night, likely the British would have simply sailed down to New York and ended the revolution by adding an army to the forces fighting there. So step one, the British send an army across the ocean, seize Quebec, and begin the march down to Lake Champlain. Arnold and his men and some others gathered in the woods at a place called Valcour Island on Lake Champlain the following fall, and built out of the woods a small navy of 7 small boats, mounted some cannon on it just to make a demonstration. Hid behind the island till the British sailed by, and with the wind not helping them, the Americans could harass them. The British had to stop and go back and fight the Americans. By the time this ended and the Americans eventually gave up, ran their boats and ran away, the British looked at Fort Ticonderoga, which was their objective, and said, you know, it's late in the year. It's going to get cold. Let's just go back to Montreal. We'll come back in the spring. So Arnold and his men delayed the British invasion of upstate New York and Fort Ticonderoga until spring. This is important because the folks who lived in upstate New York were not concerned about what was happening in Virginia and Boston. That was the revolution was somewhere else. But now the British have come to our neighborhood. So I got to grab my musket, and in the spring, I got to go join up because now this has come home. So when the British Army returned in the spring, they met a massive but untrained and undisciplined American army. Long story short, at the Battle of Saratoga, thanks literally to Arnold and some of his commanding leadership, something very unusual happened that doesn't happen much in the history of the world. The British Army surrendered whole as a result of the Saratoga battle. Seldom in the history of the world does an army surrender or be removed from a war whole. And as a result, the French were so impressed, they recognized the Americans, and many people have talked about the Battle of Saratoga leading to American independence. The British had no more money to send no more soldiers. And it was the beginning, very early, of the end of the revolution. And because of it, we have our independence. So if Arnold's men had not marched to Quebec and almost but not taken the city, and then harassed and harangued all the way down to Belcourt Island, we may not have our independence. And so that's, in a nutshell, kind of the story. I want to make sure we have time for questions. Hoping my audio is working. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you
Oh, there you
just
go.
fine. Yeah, thank you.
Wrapped
Would
it up
you,
as quickly in a nutshell. That was like months of misery in
right? It's
45 minutes.
not, this is not an easy story to
Yeah.
summarize so succinctly. We do have a couple
Mhm.
questions
Yep.
from the audience. Um, if Enos had not quit the expedition, taken all those supplies, do you think they would have fared better than they actually did?
Yeah, I guess the question is how much better, because one of the problems is if all the men were carrying the supplies, they would have needed to be fed as well. Um, it's hard to say, and there's some debate as to whether he honestly made an effort to try to fulfill his duties, and it was just too difficult, and he was mad that he didn't hear back from Arnold, and so it's difficult. But in the end, the moral of the story is we won the revolution. In large part, you can make an argument because things happened exactly the way they did, and if you change any piece of that, who knows what might have happened.
Sure.
So it's difficult. But it was Enos had always been the bad guy because he took the food and went home. So
Someone else is asking, John Montresor,
sorry, the map maker.
the map maker, yes,
Mhm.
allegedly generated the map that Arnold used to travel to Quebec. Supposedly, the map was a trick to cause Arnold to underestimate the length. Is any of that true?
I'm not. It's difficult to say. I'm not sure about that. I do know this about the map. They were made maps back then were about traveling routes, and again, mapping the someday an army might want to go to Quebec, and so they mapped the waterways because you could paddle and walk along the shore and navigate. And one of the so if you look at the map and you go to visit today, you only see what you can kind of see with the bare eye in a canoe. Nobody had horses and so on. What he didn't know was what was 100 yards further into the woods. And in the case of this important spot where you turn left or right, it was this massive swamp. And Arnold got ahead in his canoe and started to direct the men according to the map and what he could see also of the ground in exactly the worst possible direction you could go, right into the thick of the swamp. If he had pointed them in any other direction, it would have at least been slightly better. And so after all this miserable march, and not yet to the Quebecois villages, they're ankle and knee deep in swamp and muck. And this is where men froze to the ground. They'd find a little hummock to sleep on at night and freeze. And so adding to the disaster was Arnold's misreading of the map and the terrain, and directing his men exactly the wrong place. But again, all they had, there's no aerial views. They didn't have a horse to ride around and survey. They simply went from a canoe, and whether or not it was intentional, whether or not it was just the limitations of map making in the wilderness is hard to say. But the map and Arnold's use of it did make things worse for a lot of people.
Why did they leave in the fall? Did they think the trip, it's a fair question. Did they think the
Yep.
trip would be faster than it was?
Yes,
Um,
definitely.
are they in a
Yes.
rush and they're like, we can't wait till spring. We got to go now.
Now, largely, about a lot of the march is driven by a bunch of guys from Virginia, who had come to fight in Boston, walked from Virginia, and got there after Bunker Hill, and were like, "Well, we're going to fight somebody." And so Arnold, I mean, Washington really did have to occupy the men, or it was not going to be a good thing. Or they would just go home. I mean, he needed to
Yeah.
keep them occupied. So by the time they plotted and thought through it, and Reuben Coburn showed up and said, "I can build the boats. Okay, let's go." And they had anticipated a couple of weeks at the most to make their way to Quebec, and it was just everything that could go wrong did. Even if the weather had been beautiful, it would have been a much longer trip than they anticipated. So
Do you think, did Arnold ever think about abandoning the march because of the conditions?
no, I don't think so. And at some point, it depends on where you think about it. It's as easy to keep going as it is to go back because they
Mhm.
know, and when you know how far it is back all the way, say to Fort Western or the northern villages, you
Sure.
start thinking there's food and stuff. And we don't know. Maybe it's only 2/3 of the way to the Quebecois villages, and then we're going downriver, and so at some point you just gotta. I'm halfway between which is the better way to go. Arnold was very dedicated, partly for his own aggrandizement, but partly because of his commitment to the cause of fulfilling his duty and getting there and taking Quebec. And so I don't think he ever thought about turning back. And if he had, flip a coin, which way is easier and safer. So,
Yeah.
and he didn't have any coins at that point because they were in the bottom of the road. So,
Good point. Um, Richard Montgomery.
mhm.
I understand he admired Arnold. Do we know what Arnold thought of Montgomery?
um, probably not a lot at the time, not good or bad. Again, this is a cobbled together army. The problem for Arnold, and he's a sympathetic figure when you really study him, even though what he, in the end, he did something really, really bad. He was not, most of the colonial officers in the American Army, colonial army, had been British officers, whether they were British colonial officers or had been in the British Army. And the way you made your bones, as kids say today, is patronage. Somebody with the ear of the king would whisper, and you got your rank and your title and all this kind of stuff. And so the way to rise up through the old British Army, excuse me for a sec, was to bribe and cajole and get the king's favor and so on. And that meant you had to stab some people in the back because if you wanted a higher rank and there was somebody there, you had to disgrace them. So this politicking internally all over the British Empire happened and the French Empire. And Arnold didn't understand that. He had not been an old British soldier. He was a trading person. And so at some point he's fighting and he's gone through this thing and he's in Montreal and he gets called to the Continental Congress and called to account because of some rumor that somebody said you did this and how come. And he's like, well, I'm giving myself and my fortune and everything to the cause, and this is, and that kind of thing eventually led him to, he thought, realize there's no way these people are going to win a war against the greatest empire the world has ever known. They're too busy fighting amongst each other. And he probably devised, no one knows it was in his mind, but at the Battle of Saratoga, I should mention, he went over the parapet leading the charge that ended up winning the battle. And his horse went over on his leg. And as legend has it, Henry Dearborn, again, ran up to him, the fellow who had come to him in Quebec. And Arnold looked up to him and said, would you believe it? The same damn leg. But this time, having been shot at Quebec and broken at Saratoga, he was essentially disabled. The leg really didn't service him
Mm.
anymore. So Washington had put him in charge of the fortress at West Point, where the where the Army Military Academy is now. And he devised to turn it over to the British, thinking, there's no way these Americans are ever going to win the war. So I'm going to get in good with the British. And maybe after the war's over, they'll make me governor of Connecticut or, I'll benefit in some way. But these poor people, all this infighting, they're never going to win. Well, he miscalculated. He also miscalculated that the British aren't really kind to traders either. As a seafaring people, mutiny is not something they take very kindly to. And he ended up spending most of the rest of his life in Brunswick, Nova Scotia, where a lot of the loyalists ended up sort of gravitating. And he profited really not at all from either his work as a hero and basically Washington's second in command for a while, or from his traitorous behavior. So it takes a lesson both ways. But that was the relationship that he didn't necessarily understand or want to be a part of this whole politicking and that was common among armies and officers back then.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, a couple people are asking what was the change? Why this, this 180, he was such a success. Um, what made him a traitor? And so it sounds like you're saying it was sort of a backing, just kind of backing the wrong horse at one point, like thinking, misjudging
Yep.
who was going to be victorious.
Yep. And I think he was put in a place that he he could trade something of value to the British, and he said, you know what, they're going to win, so I'm going to throw in with this crowd. There's been a lot written about it and tried to study, and some people blame his wife, and it's a convenient target. It's always the woman. But there's a lot of people try to understand his motivations. No one knows for sure, but
Sure.
it had to do probably with this realization that these people I've been fighting for don't like me, and they're making my life miserable. So why don't I just go with these people? So
Hmm.
something like that.
And then kind of becomes something sort of like a man without a country, if you will,
He did.
after
Yep.
that. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because the province of Quebec remained British until 1867, I think. Um, but it was not, the colonies became independent. And so that whole, we call it, the Maritimes now, was just this sort of not quite one thing or another. And that's where a lot of the loyalists the Tories who had been in what became the United States, sort of ended up gravitating to.
Was there any consideration for navigating the Connecticut River instead of the Kennebec?
I don't think so. And Samuel, like I said, as early as Samuel de Champlain and maybe other explorers heard from the natives that there was this passageway. And Champlain was just looking for a central place with as many canoe navigable rivers to a local location, central location to trade beaver pelts. And he ended up trying there. And then, of course, the colony off of Calais in Maine that one winter, and eventually settled on Quebec, not just because there are many, many, many streams and creeks that bring Indians, Native Americans to the location, but this Gibraltar of a rock that he could build a fortified city on. So
Mhm.
there was stories and rumors going back a long time about this mythical sort of passageway. And again, if you're a there was one couple of cases where a priest and like four Native Americans nearly starved and died just as a small group traveling over it. So it was no picnic.
Mhm.
And the idea that an army could do it was just thought of as unfathomable. But there was just enough information that said, there's probably a thing here that led them to let's give it a shot. So
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, Tom. We're
thank
coming
you.
up on the end of our time. So I'll just remind folks if, any unanswered questions, you might be able to find them in the book Through a Howling
Mhm.
Wilderness, and you can get that from MHS. We appreciate your support.
If sorry to
Um,
interrupt for just a sec, I want to point
Please.
out that I succeeded in writing the book. As I said, I like to write these shorter books and let somebody else. And from 1903 till I think it was 2007, the book was published. And then there was the one book, mine, and then in the next 4 years there were five or six great big thick books about Arnold's March and the whole Saratoga campaign. So I feel vindicated, and I succeeded in making everybody else do all the work. I just kind of pushed them all along and got them started.
Very nice. Very nice. Now this again, we're just sort of getting started with our commemorations for the Semiquincentennial, the 250th anniversary. So folks, there's definitely more to come from MHS. Tom, I'm sure you'll still be making the rounds too, that folks will maybe see you giving talks like this one throughout New England. The images that I was sharing while Tom was speaking, those are all artifacts that are in the collections at MHS, and you can see all of those on our online database, Maine Memory Network. So if you just visit mainmemory.net and search Benedict Arnold, you'll find those and a lot of other artifacts that I didn't include in those slides. And this is a story too that we'll be covering more next year. Our signature exhibit for 2026 will be about the American Revolution, and certainly you can expect that Benedict Arnold and this expedition will be part of that story. So thank you again, Tom, for sharing your
Thank
time
you.
and your expertise with us. Folks, don't forget the book is called Through a Howling Wilderness, and lots more to come on the 250th from Maine Historical Society. So thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank
And I hope
you.
we see everybody back here again real soon.
Hi, guys.